Stanza 6. My whole life I have lived in pleasant thought, as if life's business were a summer mood, as if all needful things would come unsought, to genial faith, still rich in genial good. But how can he expect that others should build for him, serve for him, and at his call love him, who for himself will take no heed at all? In the sixth stanza, the poet subjects his own philosophy of life to critical evaluation. In real life, Wordsworth was never ever unduly concerned about material possessions, and he believed that whenever something was necessary for him, it would ultimately find its way to him. It is true that the speaker has genial faith and genial good. Genial means cheerful, friendly, pleasant. But is it right, is it fair, is it just for the speaker to expect others to work for him, to serve him, to look after him, and finally, when he wants to be loved, to love him? This has been the philosophy of life followed by the poet. But the poet himself questions whether this philosophy of life can stand the scrutiny of reason, of justice, of fairness. Stanza 7. I thought of Chatterton, the marvellous boy, the sleepless soul that perished in his pride, of him who walked in glory and in joy, following his plough along the mountain side. By our own spirits are we deified. We poets in our youth begin in gladness, but thereof come in the end despondency and madness. Stanza 7 is a very important stanza. In it, the poet mentions Thomas Chatterton, the English poet, the gifted English poet, who was nothing short of a genius. But he was involved in forgery and fabrication, and when the forgery and the fabrication came to be discovered, he committed suicide at the tender age of 17. Wordsworth calls him the marvellous boy, the sleepless soul who perished in his pride. The aptness of these descriptions cannot be denied. Then the poet speaks of Robert Burns, but refuses to mention him by name. Robert Burns is today Scotland's national poet. He was a farmer. He was a farm laborer. And the life of Robert Burns did have its share of pain, difficulty, and tragedy. Robert Burns passed away at the age of 37, at the young age of 37. The poet believes that the problem is that we poets allow ourselves to be deified by our own spirits. Wordsworth thus makes it clear that he has no intention to walk in these tragic footsteps and to allow himself to be deified by his own spirits. We now come to the last two lines of the stanza. We poets in our youth begin in gladness, but thereof come in the end despondency and madness. What a sweeping generalization. We poets in our youth begin in gladness. Poets have exceptionally brilliant, exceptionally bright childhoods, youths, but at the end of the day they suffer from despondency and madness. Despondency means melancholia, sorrow. I think what Wordsworth says about poets is applicable to almost all human beings. There may be exceptions, but exceptions should not be given too much importance. We begin our life in gladness. We end our life in madness. That is the destiny of poets according to Wordsworth. Why does this happen? If we read between the lines, we can understand that the poet believes that this trajectory from joy to sorrow, from gladness to madness, from happiness to melancholia, from brilliance to disaster, takes place because we poets are too much obsessed with ourselves. The poet speaks of the pride of Chatterton. Chatterton, the marvellous boy. Chatterton, the child genius, was destroyed by his own ego. He perished in his pride. He was a sleepless soul, a restless spirit. The problem is that we poets allow ourselves to be carried away by our own talents. We allow ourselves to deify ourselves because we think that we have the exceptional talent, the exceptional genius to deify ourselves. To put it in another way, we worship ourselves, and that is our tragedy. Stanza 8. Now, whether it were by peculiar grace, a leading from above, a something given, yet it befell that in this lonely place, when I with these untoward thoughts had striven, beside a pool Bare to the eye of heaven, I saw a man before me unawares, the oldest man he seemed that ever wore grey hairs. In the present stanza, the poet describes the circumstances under which he came across the leech gatherer. The poet wonders whether it was grace, whether it was divine grace, or whether it was divine decision that led him to the leech collector precisely at that point in his life when he was grappling with untoward thoughts. Untoward thoughts are inappropriate thoughts, unpleasant thoughts, thoughts that should not occur in a particular context. The poet met the leech collector by the side of a pool, naked to the eye of the sky, bare to the eye of heaven. You must remember that this is England, where it always rains, where it always snows, where it is almost always extremely cold. And the leech gatherer was naked to the eye of the sky. He was uncovered, unprotected. The poet feels that he was a very old man. Not just a very old man, he was the oldest man among old men. These lines were written by Wordsworth when he was a young man. And when you are young, the old appear to you to be objects of curiosity. Strange, weird, funny things. And now this young man, Wordsworth, has come across the oldest of men, the oldest of old men. I am reminded of what Oscar Wilde said. He observed that the youth of the present have absolutely no respect for dyed hair. Old men like me dye their hair, pretend to be young men, behave like young men, and then complain that the youth of the present have absolutely no respect for dyed hair. Stanza 9. As a huge stone is sometimes seen to lie, couched on the bald top of an eminence, wonder to all who do the same espy by what means it could thither come and whence, so that it seems a thing endued with sense, like a sea beast crawled forth that on a shelf of rock or sand reposeth there to sun itself. This stanza contains two similes. The first is that of a huge stone, a boulder, which is found on the top of a hill, high up on an eminence, making people wonder how the huge stone found its way to the top of the elevated ground, making people wonder whether it had crawled up the hill like a sea animal, crawling up a shelf of rock or sand, in order to rest there, in order to sun itself, while focusing attention on the similes, we must not forget that the central figure in the poem is the leech gatherer. The similes are only the vehicles of the poet in order to make his impression of the leech gatherer clear to us. What do these similes convey? They make it clear that the leech gatherer is part of nature. He is like a stone. He is like a sea beast. He does not have an identity of his own. He merges himself into his environment. He is very much part and parcel of nature. It has to be observed that these are typically Wordsworthian similes, nothing spectacular about them. Similes drawn from everyday life, drawn from the natural environment. Similes that make it clear that the central figure of the poem, the leech gatherer, is of the earth, earthy, like the poem and like the poet. Stanza 10. Such seemed this man, not all alive nor dead, nor all asleep. In his extreme old age, his body was bent double, feet and head, coming to gather in life's pilgrimage, as if some dire constraint of pain or rage, of sickness, felt by him in times long past, a more than human weight upon his frame had cast. We now meet with the graphic description of the leech gatherer, who is not wholly alive and not wholly dead, not wholly asleep, and certainly not wholly awake. The leech gatherer is in his extreme old age. His body is bent double, and his head and feet have come together. It appears that the leech gatherer has had more than his share of tragedy, pain, rage, sickness. It could be anything. And that this tragedy has left indelible marks on his body.